Right, everybody. Well, a very warm welcome to this NEXUS Gains webinar on the future of global river health monitoring. Yeah, and really this webinar comes from a couple of years now where a group of us have been contemplating this problem of the collection of data to represent river health at a global level. Yeah, personally, I was involved with the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think all of us have been involved in the CBD. And it's always the issue: how do you actually represent river health at a global level so that it's comparable? And there are many indices that have been developed, but we find them all a bit wanting. But I don't want to sort of preempt what some of my colleagues are going to say. A couple of weeks ago, we had a session at the World Water Week where we started this process of, or we had a really fascinating debate talking about this whole issue, and that was just a couple of weeks ago, and so now we're moving on to this. Just very briefly, the agenda. So I'm opening it now, and then we will have an overview of global river health monitoring by Dave Tickner from WWF, and then talk about the future of global river health monitoring, and that'll be Lauren. And then we've got two people to give us slightly divergent perspectives. So the one is the biodiversity perspective, and that's Abby Lynch from the US Geological Survey, and the possibility of bringing the whole new digital world into this thing, and that'll be Mpho from Digital Earth Africa. And then we will have some discussion. We'll have a discussion between the panel members, but also if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please use the Q&A, not the chat. The chat is disabled, but use the Q&A, and we will either answer questions in the Q&A or otherwise we'll raise them in this point of the discussion and talk about them online, and then we'll have a closure at the end. All right. Just to toss it out there, the definition of river health. It's funny, I can remember years and years and years ago when I first got involved in the start of a river health program in South Africa. And I was in the airport and I bumped into a very, very, very serious botanical professor from a university. And I said I was going to a river health meeting, and he looked at me and he said, well, no serious scientist would ever talk about river health. Yeah, that to talk about the health of an ecosystem was ludicrous. And yet it's become really widely adopted. And I think the issue is that we all have an intrinsic feeling of what it is to be healthy. And, there's the standard definition, the ability to adapt and to self-manage, the feeling of well-being, state of well-being. We all know what it is to be healthy. And below that, there's a definition from Carr and Dudley, and there are many definitions, but it's essentially the ability of a river ecosystem to support and maintain key ecological processes. Sorry, I've got pictures in my way now. And a community of organisms with a species composition, diversity, and functional organization as comparable as possible to that of natural habitats within the region. Obviously giving a really big plug to diversity and that it should be as natural as possible. I'm going to put these two references into the Q&A, so if anyone wants to access these two papers, which are going to come up in the conversation, then we can do so. But so now I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Dave Tickner I'll just stop sharing. I see Zoom, one person has to stop before the next person can start, so please remember that. So Dave Tickner, he's Chief Advisor for Rivers and Water at WWF in the UK, and he provides advice to river conservation programs internationally, engages governments and multinational companies on water-related issues, and directs research into global freshwater challenges and solutions. He began his career as a policy advisor in the UK government's ministry and his environment ministry, and has since spent more than 2 decades with WWF, working at the intersection of water security and biodiversity conservation in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. He's also held board and advisory roles in government, charities, the private sector, and academia. Dave trained initially as a geographer, holds a PhD in freshwater science, and is published widely in scientific and popular media. And we work together in getting this whole idea going of looking at this global river health monitoring. So, Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Just confirm you can hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
And the slides hopefully are up on the screen as well.
Yeah.
So thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's good to see a really good turnout as well. On the subject of health, I'm a little under the weather at the moment. I've got a bit of a bug. So if I start coughing and spluttering, please just bear with me a little bit. It's nothing life-threatening. River health indicators. I work for WWF, and as you can see on the screen, WWF's mission is essentially to try to build a future in which humans live in harmony with nature. What does that mean? What does living in harmony with nature look like? And how do we know if we're living in harmony? The idea of working on indicators has, I guess, been quite a rich part of WWF's work over some period of time now, because it helps us figure out the extent to which we are or are not living in harmony with nature. One of the best known indicators that I guess WWF has played a leading role in developing is the Living Planet Index. The Living Planet Index is, I think, a really nice example of an indicator that doesn't just enable us to gauge the health of the environment. It can also be an indicator which helps to inform and even influence policy debates and resource allocations. So an example of this, Living Planet Index is published every couple of years through the Living Planet Report, jointly generated by WWF and ZSL, the Zoological Society for London. I liken it to the stock market index for wildlife. It gives us an average picture of changes in populations of vertebrate species across the planet, and we can disaggregate it in different ways. So the graph on your screen now is the freshwater wildlife stock market index, or the freshwater living planet index, as I call it. It shows a pretty remarkable decline over a period since 1970, which is about the earliest we can get reliable numbers. And that decline happens to track my lifetime. I don't think that's cause and effect, by the way, but it makes it sort of quite a powerful thing to be able to say over the course of my lifetime. On average, populations of freshwater vertebrate species have declined by 83%. That's quite a startling headline statistic. It's quite a startling indicator. And we've seen this picked up in a number of different ways, most recently by the gentleman you see on the screen here. This is David Lammy. He is the UK's foreign minister. And last week he gave a speech about climate and nature, quite a sort of big speech, at least in the UK scene. And he used this number. He talked about the Living Planet Index. He talked about the 83% decline in average populations of freshwater species. And he didn't just talk about it. Off the back of that, he announced that the UK is currently scoping, the UK government is currently scoping a new program of research into nature and water. So here's an example of how an indicator can generate action. It can influence senior politicians and can generate action and investment. So the Freshwater Living Planet Index gives us some sort of top line indicator of how healthy freshwater ecosystems are. Answer is not very, if you judge by this, but it doesn't really give us much sort of granular detail about or why this decline is happening. So one of the other things that WWF has invested in is development of an indicator called the Connectivity Status Index. This is a piece of work that was published 5 years ago now, led by Gunther Grill, who I think I saw might be on the call actually, then of McGill University. The idea of this was to take a look at river connectivity. We know that connectivity is a key aspect of river health. We know that connectivity had been impaired by construction of water infrastructure and disruption of or alteration of river flows globally. We wanted to develop an indicator, preferably a scalable indicator, that could help us gauge what was happening at the global level, but also be used locally as well at the basin scale. And this is the kind of headline map that came out of our analysis when we deployed the indicator we developed, the Connectivity Status Index. And it gives us a sort of fairly easily digestible map or visual image of what's happening to connectivity globally. In the far north, it's okay. In a couple of the sort of big tropical basins, the Amazon, the Congo, etc., it's okay. But in large parts of the world, connectivity has been significantly impaired, to the extent that in many parts of the world, there are very few medium or large free-flowing rivers. So that, again, gives us clues globally as to what's happening with river health. A piece of work that Gunther and myself and some other people are working on right now is really trying to turn that sort of snapshot map globally into something that can show us change over time, so more of a sort of a functional indicator that can be used for monitoring policy implementation, policy effectiveness, and give clues as to where greater action is needed. Importantly, we wanted this sort of indicator to be spatially and temporally explicit. And so here's a couple of sort of early sites of the kind of stuff that's coming out of the work we've been doing more recently, showing us for the Amazon and the Danube how connectivity has changed over time. Blue basically means pretty much unimpaired connectivity. And then the more you move through this sort of yellow, orange, red scales, you're getting into very impaired connectivity. And that's quite useful because it can give us a sense of the kind of policy responses that we might need. So we can see that there are going to be some big challenges for protecting river health, particularly connectivity aspects in the Amazon coming forward, whereas in the Danube, there's potentially a huge amount we could do to try to restore connectivity, to try to restore river health that's been affected by disruptions to connectivity. We hope this work will be published probably early next year. Connectivity is, as I said, an important facet of river health, but if you go by the definition that Chris showed us earlier, there's a lot more to it than that. And I suppose the next part of my journey on this was when I led a team that produced an emergency recovery plan for freshwater biodiversity. This was intended to try to influence the global biodiversity framework and potentially the sustainable development goals as well. That emergency recovery plan basically set out 6 quite high-level actions that were needed to try to restore the health of freshwater ecosystems, including rivers globally. And it was always the intention off the back of this to do some work to develop something like a scorecard or a dashboard or an indicator or set of indicators that we could use to track the extent to which these actions are being implemented. Now, I've showed you the connectivity work that we're doing. That relates to the 6th action that we set out in the emergency recovery plan, but that leaves another 5 actions that need some sort of tracking. And so when Chris came to me a couple of years ago and sort of invited me to start getting involved in some of the work he was doing on looking at the extent to which international agreements and the indicators that were built into international agreements were tracking things like freshwater biodiversity, I thought that was really quite timely. The first piece of work that Chris led in this space was really looking at the SDGs. And trying to look not just for freshwater, but more broadly, the extent to which SDG indicators were really tracking the health of ecosystems and biodiversity. I suppose the short answer, the short version of that paper is not much. But now we're at the stage where there's work going on to develop indicators or agree indicators for the global biodiversity framework. And we know that the answer for that is likely to be, at least for some of these sort of key facets of river health, not much again. So how do we change that? How do we go into perhaps the next round of negotiation of the Sustainable Development Goals or the Global Biodiversity Framework, which may be happening sort of in the late 2020s up to 2030? How do we go into those negotiations with oven-ready indicators that we can give to the international community and say, this is how you do it. Please build them into future versions of these international agreements. We just haven't had those yet. And so that led to the project that we're going to go, that we're going to talk a little bit about in more detail today. I'm not going to go into this bit too much detail. That'll be Lauren following on. But basically, as Chris noted when he flashed up those 2 references briefly, there were kind of 2 stages to this work. The NEXUS Gains project invested, I guess, primarily in the first phase, which was the bulk of the work. And that was a piece of work to review existing recent large-scale river health monitoring programs, things that have been developed at the national or transnational level in places like South Africa or China, New Zealand, the US, the European Union, and really trying to glean from those river health monitoring programs. How were people going about measuring river health, and what sort of indicators were they using? Off the back of that work, which was published in a report through IMI, we then developed a paper which Lauren led, which was really trying to set out a pathway, building on some of those lessons from other large-scale monitoring programs, a pathway for trying to consolidate a set of indicators by 2030, potential to improve them beyond, that would give us much more comprehensive view of river health, how it's changing at the global level, but also help to inform development of other river health monitoring programs at national and other levels. Today, Lauren will talk about that a little bit more, but I guess I wanted to sort of finish with a couple of notes. The first is that I think there's some urgency to this. There are existing commitments that governments have made through the Global Biodiversity Framework, through the SDGs, also to some extent through the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, through the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk, through the Ramsar Convention. There are existing commitments that governments have made to try to restore ecosystems, including rivers. There's a big effort now through the Freshwater Challenge to try to help governments and potentially the private sector as well to really scale up and accelerate their efforts to do this. But we will need some sort of set of indicators that can help governments and others track their progress without giving them a huge amount of extra work to do. So this isn't just an academic piece of work. There are avenues for using this within existing policy frameworks. The second thing I wanted to say was really about the fact that this can't just be a sort of a technical exercise. It's not enough to just develop some indicators, use them and hide the data somewhere on the internet or not even publish it at all. There is an aspect of this which is around communication. And I think one of the things that we have to think carefully about in perhaps future phases of this work is how indicators can be used to really raise the profile of river health as a key sustainability issue, up there with tropical forests and the health of the oceans. Some work has been done on this. So colleagues out of WWF US working with, well, a wide range of people globally, and also building on some work that's been done elsewhere in the US and Australia, have tried this idea of basin report cards or river health scorecards, which give these sort of very attractive, very easy to digest visual representations of the health of a river system. The one here happens to be from the lower Kafue system in Zambia. But even then, I don't think that's quite enough. I think there is a whole bunch of work that we need to think about, which is how we tell the story of what's happening to rivers and how investing in river health can bring all sorts of benefits to people and to wildlife. We know, and social and cognitive sciences tell us, that data and numbers don't change minds. You've got to tell stories as well, not instead, but as well, in a way to emotionally engage people and get people to care about the issue. If we can do those two things in conjunction, get better data on what's happening to river health and tell better stories, then I think we can be optimistic about the future of our rivers. Anyway, I will leave it there. Chris, I don't know if I'm handing back to you or if I'll hand straight over to Lauren.
Yeah, thanks very much. So Dave, if you can just stop sharing. Right, so next up, we've got Lauren Cohen, who is a freshwater ecologist based in Washington State, USA, where she conducts diverse studies on rivers, lakes, and wetlands. Her work is generally done in close collaboration with organizations doing on-the-ground conservation work, including state, federal, and local government, tribal organizations, and nonprofits. Whether looking for endemic fish in the wetland or writing about conservation trends, her work reflects a long-standing commitment and recognition that sustainability of natural resources is inextricable with social dimensions of history, education, technology, development, and policy. Lauren, take it away.
So yes, I'm really pleased to be here. And Dave, thank you for that wonderful presentation and preface. So much to think about, and I'll probably reference some of that in this talk. So my name is Lauren Keeney, and I'm really happy to be able to present the work of my collaborators and colleagues who are doing freshwater ecology conservation restoration work around and data analysis work around the world on freshwaters. And what I'm going to be presenting is that we developed a framework for global river health monitoring. And I think it's really fitting to lead off with this image of this LiDAR image of a floodplain, which many of us by now, we see these in our work now, because it's not only beautiful, they're not only beautiful, but they're such a visual representation, a story in some ways, a visual story of aspects of rivers and river health that we literally could not see before, and the opportunities that lie in many emerging technologies to quantify and measure and river health in new ways. So remote sensing, whether it's drone or satellite or anything like that, is only one of many of these opportunities that are emerging and we're surrounded by. Things like biological and in situ monitoring of sensors, but also environmental DNA are an example. Citizen science efforts around the world. And then lastly, innovations and improvements in modeling efforts such as machine learning. All of these have profound implications and importance and opportunities for advancing river health. However, before we get captivated by the promise of the future, we have to recognize that each of these also requires a lot of investment in infrastructure. And that investment might be scientific investment, it may be political, social capital, cultural capital that we have to invest around developing and operationalizing these toward advancing river health. So toward that, that's one of the things that inspired this work, only one of them. But so why do we even need a global river health framework? Why did we set about this work? So as Dave and also Chris talked about, the importance of indicators in being able to advocate for the representation of rivers and river health is in global, but not only global, but also at more local and regional scales, initiatives. We can't measure what we can't describe in a state. And also, not only we have to be able to describe the current state, but we also have to be able to describe the change in that state over time, which some of which Dave, was able to share with indicators and change over time. Those are very powerful indicators and metrics and stories. Secondly, is that rivers don't fit inside our jurisdictions. They cross political, social, cultural boundaries. And so we need to have a way to manage and represent and talk about them across these different jurisdictions for purposes of management restoration. And then I think it can be really easy to lose sight of this because in many ways our rivers are so tamed now. But nearly every aspect of human society is impacted by the health of our rivers, everything from agriculture to recreation, to ecosystem health of our forests. All of these things are impacted by river health. And so talking about river health is talking about the health of our societies. And then lastly, as I talked about before, an important reason is to provide this roadmap. How do we focus development both on our current and available technologies, but also these emerging technologies in order to advance this goal? So that's why we embarked on this work. The specific objectives of our work were to create a roadmap for policy relevant global river health monitoring. And the way that we went about that is we said, well, let's look to the past and say, there has been decades of investment from regions and countries in learning how to do this and how to do it in a robust, validated way that is policy relevant. So we wanted to look at that work. And from that, especially to identify what is a scalable framework of indicators. If we want to talk about robust indicators of river health, how do we represent that in terms of indicators? So to do that, Dave talked about this review. There was the larger review work, and then there was the kind of more filtered, I guess, work, which is about visioning, taking that review work and then visioning the future from that. But the frameworks that we use to evaluate river health, this is a list of you can see, they're not a lot of these, and they tend to be in countries that have been able to invest in these efforts, but many of them have been in place for a long time, and they represent enormous investments by many governments and scientists in learning how to assess river health, the ecosystem state and the condition, but also to validate and test, and then not only validate and test the scientific process, but the implementation into policy, right? So there's many lessons to be learned from here. And we also, among these lessons, is that we can see the change over time in the increasing inclusion of new indicators, or especially based on modeling and remote sensing. So again, lots of lessons learned. The lessons that I'm going to kind of focus on are these indicators, the suite of indicators. So one thing we really wanted to focus on is how, one more thing. We had two criteria for these frameworks. They needed to assess, we thought, for informing global river health monitoring, we wanted to look at large-scale regional or national assessment programs. And then they also needed to focus on surveillance monitoring, or monitoring the ecosystem state. And this is the take-home for the indicators. These were the suite of indicators. So there were 4 components that showed up again and again, indicating that, like, if we want to measure river health, this is what we need to have represented. The 4 components: biology, physical habitat, water quality, and hydrology. And then within that, this was the suite of indicators that shows up again and again. And this, in effect, becomes, for the paper, or the future river health monitoring framework that we want to develop, this becomes our assignment. How do we then create monitoring programs that can address this or assess this at even global scales? So we took that and then we developed this into what we call this framework. Now, where our work departs from many other types of work in the same vein is that these indicators, for the most part, reflect biophysical conditions and reflect ecosystem state or condition. So it's far easier at large scales to measure pressure on systems. However, the drawback to that is that measuring pressures on systems doesn't tell you the condition, nor does it give you the actual condition. It also doesn't give you a lot of information about how you might correct or address. And then, really importantly, it doesn't give you a way to measure change in the ecosystem, to report on the health or report on the actual change. So from that, we considered all the potential indicators that were in these frameworks. We didn't say which ones are easy, which ones, we said, what do we need to work on? And then we assessed its technological readiness. In this way, I have this citation up here. In this way, our work is sort of akin to the essential biodiversity variables, which we want to call out and acknowledge for sure. So then in this framework, we evaluated feasibility of implementation from a data or technological standpoint by 2030, which is basically kind of now. And then, given investments in what we thought would be the most promising opportunities for data development, what was the prognosis for 2050? We included and allowed, I guess, but also emphasized integration of 3 types of main data sources. This is in situ or on the ground biological or water quality type of data, remote sensing, and modeling. So we acknowledge and allow for all of those types of data and also the integration of those. For now, we made the decision to not include human valuation of rivers. This was a decision that is often an indicator of river health, is the social and political and cultural dimensions. However, our position is that we felt like it was really important to understand the ecosystem state, to which then the human social valuations, these other valuations, are then added onto it. And then this was really important, is that we wanted to, the framework needed to acknowledge that there is a lot of work happening at multiple scales, everything from local to regional to national and then international. And then there's top-down work. So there's bottom-up work that's happening, there's top-down work. In order to integrate and bring these two together, we need to have a standardized geospatial framework that has defined spatial units in order to aggregate and then downscale and bring these two types of information together and make use of all of that type of work that's going on. Okay, here's the framework. Don't worry, I'm going to break this down. But this is the sort of ugly back end of it. But here are represented all of our different types of indicators here. And for each of these, we then, I'm going to just talk about one of them, fish abundance, which is a common indicator that shows up for biological monitoring. And for each of these, this framework shows a couple of things, and then shows the inclusion, the current implementation in regional and global programs. So you can see where this indicator is currently being represented at large scales and how it's being implemented, the examples of it. We then move into the data challenges, which really are the research priorities. This is really our research tasks. If we are going to operationalize this indicator at global scales, what are our opportunities that are best kind of the scientific community needs to grapple with. And then here, and I didn't realize this, we put a shout out to the Living Planet Index, our best opportunities currently in 2030 for implementation at a global scale in 2030, and then with investment and development of data opportunities, where we see this or where we see that being able to be possible by 2050. So this is sort of the nuts and bolts, the roadmap, if you will, for implementing this framework at global scales. Now, data, Dave talked about this, data isn't enough. There needs to be concurrently work and attention by the entire community that are working at on these issues on a couple of what we called enabling factors, or things that really need to be in place and or will really facilitate the actual implementation of this work. The first of these is, whenever possible, adopting river health monitoring as a priority at multiple scales. This can be local, regional, or global, but how do we bring this? We need to have it talked about. We need to have it brought into policy initiatives and acknowledged as an important part and a priority. The second is this commitment to this common framework, and then coordinating efforts for data development and data synthesis, right? It's sort of like, where are we investing our time in data development and data synthesis? And then we really thought that it was very important to identify and strongly promote an international organization that can coordinate this work, not do the work, but again, coordinate the many types of work that are going on at multiple scales. And so these can seem like big ambitions. However, I think we have to really acknowledge that they're already happening. They're already present in many scales. And so we can see things like the nature restoration law and policy changes in many countries that are going on to acknowledge nature-based solutions. I'm so excited that Empo from DEA, his Digital Earth Africa, is going to be talking, because among the groups around the world that are trying to grapple with this, I think DEA offers this amazing example of operationalizing what this means to really grapple with how do we develop data methods and scale them to large scales, and to do it in policy relevant ways. And then lastly, there's examples of data compilation and data synthesis and citizen science efforts that are going around onto. So our intention with this framework was to try and help highlight, emphasize, and sort of focus efforts by the scientific community to grapple with and pull together these efforts toward this vision of river health monitoring. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lauren. If you can stop sharing, yeah. That's awesome. So please remember, everybody, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And then we will be having a discussion section on the agenda a little bit later. Thank you, Lauren. So the next step is really, when right from the beginning, and when we started looking at this whole issue of developing a global river health monitoring program, the big issue was always about diversity, because it seemed to be the most awkward to fit into a large-scale program. And so Abby Lynch is going to be bringing in the biodiversity perspective. And so Abby is a research fish biologist within the US Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center. She's also the coordinator of the International In-Fish Research Network, an associate editor for Fisheries Management and Ecology, and a member of the IUCN Fisheries Expert Group and Freshwater Fish Specialization Group. She's based in Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. Abby, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you for the opportunity to present on this element of this important discussion. So, yeah, as Chris noted, the fact that biodiversity is kind of the most difficult element to grapple with and trying to think of these large-scale river health programs, we just wanted to give a little I wanted to give a little grounding here as we begin this discussion. So, and this probably doesn't need repeating, but I think it's important to just take a quick moment to really reflect on freshwater biodiversity and how amazing it is. When you think that freshwater systems cover less than 1% of the Earth's surface, yet they're home to at least 10% of the world's species. The fact that these systems are so vitally important, and that the fact that there's so much diversity within them is an important point to emphasize. And as many have already alluded to, and I don't think I need to belabor this point, freshwater species are really among the most threatened on Earth. So approximately, or over, I think it's more than 1/3 of species from freshwater systems are threatened. And there's been a decline by 84% in freshwater biodiversity since 1970. And just to emphasize, in this WWF graphic, that rate of loss is more than 2 times that of marine or terrestrial systems. So when you think of global declines in biodiversity, it really is the biodiversity in freshwater systems that's dragging down that curve. And this is probably another point that I don't need to emphasize too much, but when we think about biodiversity and how closely associated biodiversity is with many different services and for people, and all of the contributions that they make to people, it leads you to really wonder kind of why they're so neglected in these kind of large scale discussions. And so as Lauren and Dave and Chris all kind of alluded to, when you think about river health, I don't think there's anyone that would argue that biodiversity is not a component of it. And clearly they're important. Clearly they're in decline. Why is it that they're not really represented in these programs? Why are they so difficult to manage or consider at this scale? So, I mean, I think it comes down to a few fairly basic aspects of this, but there really are logistical constraints for incorporating them into these kind of large scale planning activities. In general, these data are hard to collect, so they're really broadly lacking at that scale. So it's not something that can be easily kind of integrated at a global scale. And a lot of programs really try to rely on simple indicators. So when you think about monitoring water quality, chemical and physical properties of water are easier to monitor and measure than biodiversity in those systems. So and frankly, they're cheaper to do too. So the process of including these kind of monitoring elements around biodiversity is really a more substantial lift than something like water quality. And then second, and this kind of alludes to the point that Dave really made at the end of his presentation, existing policies are likely to focus more on immediate human types of needs, and not necessarily recognize the importance of biodiversity to kind of overall river health. And so, they may not even be considered in these planning processes or implementation efforts. And I think Dave's point about bringing in those stories and really making those connections to people, that will have a major driving factor in this level of discussion and this level of integration. So, it's one thing to say all these problems, and when you consider the status of freshwater diversity and rivers more generally, obviously things are still in decline. So what we've necessarily done in the past may not necessarily be the best model we want to use in the future. And so I'm a fish biologist, so I like using the term, instead of thinking outside of the box, I like saying think outside of the fishbowl for new solutions to try to integrate biodiversity into these monitoring programs, and more generally thinking about biodiversity, freshwater biodiversity at this global scale. So very quickly, I'm just going to provide one example of a project that I'm working on that is doing this at not necessarily the scale of rivers globally, but one element of biodiversity in this kind of context. I'm working on helping develop an indicator for inland fisheries at a global scale that could be integrated into river monitoring efforts. So this approach that we're doing, we're essentially pulling together threats to inland fisheries using a three-pronged approach. So we're using expert elicitation and systematic literature review that's then being used to kind of weight threats using a publicly available data sets. And so from there, we're in the process, and this is hopefully will be submitted shortly, but we're pulling together kind of a global threat map that can be used as a proxy for monitoring inland fisheries, mostly because, and we don't need to go into this here, but mostly because inland fisheries, you can't really assess the same way that you do marine fisheries, just because we can't, there's many issues and a host of reasons why. So we're looking at this as basically like a proxy indicator. And then lastly, so from there, basically we can collapse these into kind of an index of threat. And then the last element of this, and this alludes to some of the kind of concepts of basin reports or report cards. I think Dave mentioned that in his presentation, but we're looking to kind of ground truth this with local information. So it's kind of a top-down and bottom-up approach where we're basically trying to create these basin report cards linked with local level information to kind of ground truth how well the global scale work is being done. And so, yeah, and I just want to kind of emphasize on that last point that local data, there are many efforts going on around the globe that are, very strongly bringing in really robust local level data. And, taking those or using those is something that is sometimes difficult to kind of scale up when we think of these large scale approaches. But I think, that's something that can really help ground truth these larger scale attempts to really tackle this important issue. So with that, I know we're probably close on time here, but I just wanted to close with my email address if folks have questions about that project in general or anything else. So with that, I think I will stop sharing. And it should be
awesome. Thank you, Abby. Yeah, this is as Abby says, thinking out of the fish pond. But the concept of a threat map is really, really powerful. But as Abby said, they're still proxies, and perhaps the ground truthing then is where you could bring in the biodiversity, etc. But at the end of the day, there's still only a little consideration of the biodiversity itself, the final response indicator. But that's the most difficult. So it's a really challenging issue. Thank you so much. So next we have Mpho Siddiqui from Digital Earth Africa. Now I just want to give a plug for Digital Earth Africa before she starts. I'm always often amazed at how many people don't know about Digital Earth Africa, people in Africa. And essentially this is a big program where they're collecting all of the most up-to-date Earth observation data into one place. But what's most interesting is that they're developing all sorts of ways of bringing the data together to tell a story. And what they're doing is just truly awesome. The quality of what they're doing, the integration of the data is amazing. So Mpho, she's an Earth observation data scientist at Digital Earth Africa, based in Pretoria, South Africa. In her role, she is part of the science team that develops products and services using Earth observation to provide insights that support sustainable development across Africa. Her work includes a particular focus on wetland ecosystems. Thank you very much, Mpho.
Thank you so much, Chris. My name is Mpho Siddiqui, and as I've been introduced, I'm an Earth observation data scientist for Digital Earth Africa. And today I'll provide a perspective on digital solutions for global river health monitoring. So I'll basically give a brief illustration of the power of Earth observation, or the power that Earth observation could potentially have in river health monitoring on a global scale. With its near global coverage, Earth observation allows us to monitor rivers from space, even in the most remote areas or hard to reach areas. It enables us to track river dynamics in real time, observe seasonal and long-term changes in water flow, assess the quality, as well as evaluate the habitat conditions. So it fills a critical data gap where ground-based measurements are limited or unavailable. And unlike traditional monitoring methods, which are often localized and intermittent, EO provides a continuous and comprehensive view, which enables us to have more of a broader picture across regions and even globally. So this capability is key to understanding the health of rivers in a changing climate and managing them sustainably. So we believe that by integrating EO with in situ measurements, we gain a more complete and reliable understanding of river systems, thus allowing us to identify trends, predict changes, and make informed decisions for their management. One key challenge, though, with river health monitoring when it comes to Earth observation is that we cannot directly measure biodiversity. So although we can't do that, Earth observation does give us powerful tools and powerful ways for us to assess the environmental conditions that influence river health. And I think we can group these into 3 categories as they pertain to Earth observation. We can look at water quality, where we can look at things like turbidity, chlorophyll levels, suspended matter, which are critical to understanding the health of aquatic habitats. And these can, of course, affect the availability of oxygen and nutrients, and they also influence the ecosystems they support. We can also look at physical habitats, where we can get proxies for riparian vegetation, looking at land use, land cover change for the areas around these river systems. We can also look at hydrological indicators, looking at the exchanges in surface water extent, flow variability, and just overall seasonal changes in river dynamics. And by tracking these hydrological patterns, we can assess how they're responding to natural events and human activities, and potentially detect early signs of stress. We can already see some of these proxies being extracted at a continental level through Digital Earth Africa, utilizing open source data sets and cloud computing. One key product that Digital Earth Africa creates is the GeoMAD, which serves as a surface reflectance geomedian. This service gives you a cloud-free composite of satellite data compiled over specific timeframes, making it ideal for long-term time series analysis. And because it's cloud-free, it's very good for statistical accuracy as well. And from these GeoMads, we're able to extract other proxies, which include water observation from space and water bodies monitoring, which allow us to leverage the USGS Landsat Archive to provide historical surface water extent. We can also look into things like land use, land cover, monthly NDVI anomalies, which could give us some information into the vegetation in the surrounding area, as well as fractional cover. So these are only a few of the products that Digital Earth Africa extracts, but I believe that these could be potentially expanded and extracted continentally, considering that they do use open data and rely on cloud computing for extraction. The open source nature of these data sets make them scalable. So with the framework that Digital Earth Africa already has, it's easy for us to be able to actually expand and present them at a larger scale. Furthermore, Digital Earth Africa also demonstrates the potential for localized workflows, which enable the extraction of water quality indicators such as turbidity, suspended matter, and chlorophyll. But of course, we understand that EO has its limitations, and we see these through the issue of spatial and temporal resolution. Many of the EO, especially the open data sets that are available, have a coarser spatial resolution, which can make it challenging to capture these smaller rivers or narrower rivers. And additionally, there's an issue of temporal resolution as well, because it might not necessarily align with the frequency of ecological changes, limiting our ability to detect short-term fluctuations. Secondly, there's an issue of cloud cover, which can hinder satellite observations. Cloudy conditions can obscure the views of rivers, leading to gaps in the data collection, and this can be particularly problematic in tropical regions where cloud is prevalent. There's also an issue of the need for validation. Your data does need to be validated against in situ measurements to ensure the accuracy of the outputs. But we see every day we see exciting advances in hydrological monitoring from the EO space. And one notable mission is the Surface Water and Ocean Topography satellite that was launched in 2022. It was designed to estimate river discharge for many rivers where in situ measurements are unavailable. So with time, we'll be able to leverage data from this satellite. We also saw a few years ago ICESat-2, which was primarily designed for glacier and sea ice measurements, but we're also seeing that there are some applications in monitoring river surface height as well. And another exciting thing that we see in Earth observation is the integration of hydrological modeling with satellite data, which facilitates the advanced analysis of the hydrological cycle. So this integration allows for improved modeling of water flows and storage across river systems. So Earth observation provides essential global coverage and temporal insights that are crucial for effective river health monitoring. And with this ability to track changes over time and across vast areas, we're able to potentially identify emerging issues within river ecosystems. Thank you very much. And there's my email if you want to know more about Digital Earth Africa and some of the work that we do as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah, so we have a few minutes now for questions. And Paul, yeah, thank you. Yeah, as Lauren pointed out earlier, this is all very well, but what's really needed now is to put this, what we know, what we're able to do, into action at a global level and develop some sort of way forward to actually get it to happen at a global level. And we have the CBDs sort of imminent at the moment, and it's really important that this kind of thing should get into the development of indicators for the CBD going forward. I just want to bring in a couple of questions. The first was Derek Vollmer, who was author of a very good paper on a river health monitoring system, and he asks, how does climate change affect the appropriateness of natural reference points when measuring river health? Are there indicators and/or regions that may need reconsidering? What about that? It's a challenging issue, this whole concept of reference sites.
Yeah, I guess, Chris, maybe I can top in really quickly, and I see Dave unmuted, so I'll be brief. But the program I work for is a climate adaptation program, so we grapple with this all the time. And I will not say that we have a great solution to it, other than acknowledging that the reference points that we have from the past are no longer going to be relevant as systems are changing. And at least getting over that initial hurdle often opens up conversations in a way that kind of perpetually looking back can kind of stifle more innovative approaches. So I know that was really a very non-helpful answer, but I'll just start the conversation with that.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, I think Abby's probably being a bit modest there. I think she's done as much thinking about this as anybody else, and she's even written a paper on future-proofing freshwater biodiversity conservation attempts, which you might take a look at, because I think it says some useful stuff on this. There are other people. I know Sam Capon from where's Sam from? The Australian Rivers Institute, maybe, has also done some quite good work looking at this in relation to environmental flows in particular. So there is some work out there on this. I mean, I have a little bit of a philosophical problem, increasingly so, with the idea of reference conditions and reference points. I think one of the hard questions we need to ask ourselves as people who care about river health going forward is less about what it used to look like in the past and more about what it could look like in the future. And in particular, in what other people have called working rivers, which are, most of the rivers in the temperate latitudes, most of the rivers where there are lots of people. The idea of some kind of natural or even semi-natural reference conditions, I think is a tough one to consider. I think we'd be much better off to ask ourselves, given the cities that have been built on the banks of these rivers, given the fact we're likely to have some sort of intensive agriculture, given that a lot of water infrastructure isn't going to go away, how healthy could we make these rivers? How much biodiversity could we get in these rivers? How could we come up with the best portfolios of ecosystem services that benefit a range of groups of people from particular rivers over the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, and try and work towards that rather than harking to some reference conditions. Sometimes they've been set according to some arbitrary point in time in the past. Sometimes they're actually genuinely useful. So I'm not saying we should get rid of reference conditions altogether, but I'd like us to be a lot more future facing.
Yeah, I must say, personally, I'm a bit of an absolutist when it comes to this. I feel that at least we should document the best possible reference condition we can, even if we have to actually put together data to describe the reference condition. And thereafter, at least then we know how far we've changed. So we can then describe a new one based on the new climate, but that's changed. And perhaps we are responsible for that, but it is still changed. So personally, I think it's good to have a reference point, so at least we know how far we've come. But anyway, that's just me. There's one other question from an anonymous person. Given that changes in the freshwater biodiversity are not always synonymous with declines or decreased diversity, for example, range expansions and increasing diversity in historically colder, less biodiverse regions, how would these instances, in theory, be captured by future river health monitoring approaches? Who would take that?
I'm happy to chip in, but I don't want to be the sort of dominant voice in this if other people have got ideas.
Well, go for it. You're the unmuted one now.
I think it's a really important question. It's, we environmentalists can be a bit doom and gloom sometimes, and for sure there are a few challenges left to grapple with, but sometimes stuff does get better as well. Whether that's beavers in Europe or the Indus River dolphin beginning a recovery, or there's even been some stuff here in the UK where rivers are a very hot topic at the moment. There's been some stuff about recovery of macroinvertebrates to some extent in the newspapers in the last couple of weeks. So, biodiversity does sometimes get better. I think any well-designed river health monitoring program should capture that. I guess there's always going to be a question about the sensitivity of large-scale indicators to what might be quite specific, sometimes species-specific or jurisdiction-specific changes, though. I don't know the extent to which we've sort of done any work on that sort of sensitivity analysis in our global framework. But certainly when you're developing national or subnational monitoring schemes, you'd want those schemes to be sensitive to significant, I don't necessarily mean that in the statistical sense, but important changes in biodiversity, whether those are improvements or things getting worse. So design of those programs, perhaps using the framework that we've set out at the global level, or drawing on it at least, they need to be well designed, and they need to be able to show when investments are working, as well as when they're not.
Thank you, Dave.
If there's time, I can weigh in on that just really briefly too.
Yep.
Okay, I'll go for it really quickly. So yeah, this is a great question. And I think in some ways it's very relevant to the emphasis on ecosystem condition, understanding condition versus threats. So understanding condition has to be locally relevant, right? Like condition in Europe looks different than condition in the Amazon, et cetera. So assessment of condition is always going to have this local framing or understanding. So, but by emphasizing and understanding how we can measure ecosystem condition and state, we can reflect that local perspectives better. Secondly, I think this is where emerging technologies come in. They're not only bring us new opportunities, they're literally making things visible that have not been visible in the past. I think environmental DNA is a great example. usually it's finding more diversity, more biodiversity than we thought was present. And so bringing these new technologies in and allowing that they give us new insights is a really important aspect of this conversation. So thanks for that question.
Guys, we actually have run out of time, so we're going to have to pull it to a close. Thank you so much for everyone participating, and especially for our speakers. I think it comes across to me as a really rich effort to solve what I think is quite a large environmental issue. The fact that our most vulnerable ecosystem is probably the least monitored. It's bizarre, and yet it's difficult, as we've highlighted. And so let's hope that that we can actually chart a way forward at a global level. There are many countries who are doing a wonderful job at a country level, wonderful job, but we need to scale those. Somehow it's got to become global. Thank you so much, everybody, for your speakers, for your wonderful contributions, and for everybody who attended. And just lastly, the next NEXUS Gains webinar will be circulated soon. I can't put it up on the screen right now, but it will be announced quite shortly. So thank everybody, and have a good remainder of your day.